There's an old joke that I have always found hilarious, and about 50% of people find this joke uproariously funny. The other 50% think it's the dumbest thing they've ever heard. And how you react to it will be a good indicator for how you react to the origin story of Homer's Iliad. So you may be wondering what on earth this joke has to do with the Homeric cycle and the myths that Homer tells in the Iliad and the Odyssey. Well, I will get to it, I promise. But first, let me tell the joke. So, a guy walks into a bar, and his head is shaped like an orange. Now, the bartender, rather justifiably, is curious about this. He's not seen a person with an orange for a head before, but he feels that it would somehow be impolite to ask just straight up, why is your head an orange? It's sort of like asking, why are your eyes so far apart? So he keeps his cool, serves the guy his drink, serves him another after that. And gradually, as the evening wears on, the bartender's curiosity just gets the better of him, and he says, I'm so sorry if this is rude, but I have to know, I don't see many people whose heads are fruits. Why is your head an orange? And the guy says, well, there's a story behind that. You see, one day I was walking down the beach and a treasure chest washed up, like out of one of the stories, like out of a pirate story. And I opened the treasure chest, and in the treasure chest there is a lamp. And the lamp looks like something right out of Disney's Aladdin. So what do? Well, of course, I just rub the lamp, and out pops a genie, I swear to you, and says, I will grant you 3 wishes. So I say, really? Is that a thing? I didn't know that was real. Genie says, absolutely anything you want. I say, I wish for $1 billion. Genie snaps his fingers, second treasure chest washes up on shore. I open it up, $1 billion in cold hard cash. So you say, this is amazing. I wish I were a famous movie star. I walk home. There's paparazzi lining my driveway. I live suddenly in a $1 million mansion where previously I had just had an apartment. I'm living the life of Riley. And now this is where I think things got a little off track, he says, because at that point, I wished that my head was an orange. I am now going to do what you should never ever do, which is I'm going to explain the joke, because it is not necessarily immediately apparent to everybody, and the point is to get us into talking about the opening of the Homeric myth. So, the point of the joke is that sometimes you have everything you want. Sometimes life is going great, and for some reason, you make the most self-destructive, absurd choice you could possibly make. And the insight into human nature that this joke gives is, I think, very telling for us as we start to tell the story of the Judgment of Paris. So we are embarking now on one of the great young heretics' journeys. We're going to tell, as best I can, I'm going to tell you the whole story of the Homeric mythic cycle in its in-universe chronological order. That is, not in the order that events occur in the poems, because that can be a little bit out of order sometimes. It comes sort of step by step. We're telling one story of the rage of Achilles, but it's surrounded by all of these other myths that would have been taken for granted as part of the store of common knowledge for Homer's original audience, and for anybody listening to the poem later on or reading it. It was understood that the whole thing took place within a universe of myths and characters that people knew about. So there's really no such thing as a spoiler in a Homeric poem. In other words, I can't ruin the poem for you by telling you what happens. It's sort of like if somebody were to write a poem today about, Johnny Appleseed, or indeed Superman or Batman. We all basically know the outline of the story. The art and the excitement and the surprise is all in seeing how things get played out and what kinds of psychological insights you can bring to bear on this basic story template. And the Homeric legends already take place within this larger network of mythology. We are on this journey in part because I've always wanted to revisit the Homeric poems with you, and I think they're just so rich and so endlessly full of instructive, exciting stuff. but also because there's a movie coming out that starts at the very end of the Homeric journey. It ends with Odysseus returning home, and that's what this movie that's coming out is about. It's called The Return, coming out later this year. And I thought it would be really fun if all of us on Young Heretics could kind of go into this story knowing the background and the whole enormous kind of backdrop that's supposed to be behind this whole tale. And so to start us off today, I want to tell you the story of the Judgment of Paris, which is a little bit like the Orange Head myth. It's the inciting incident that sets us off on this whole epic cycle that causes, in a distant way, the Trojan War, but that Homer never alludes to except at the very, very end of the poem. And this is a good example of why I think the Iliad and the Odyssey were both composed with the whole thing in mind. Because at the very end of all these 24 books, this enormous skirmish, battle, catastrophic disaster between the Greeks and the Trojans, and the downfall, the imminent downfall of Troy, after the whole thing is almost spent and the shouting is almost done, we get just this very light allusion to the very first and tiniest decision that set this chain of events in motion. And one of the things it does, by just touching on this recollection here of how everything got started, is it reminds us that this grand sweep of historical events was set off by the smallest and in some ways most ridiculous decision by this one guy who, through his momentary lapse in judgment, doomed his entire city. This is about the judgment of Paris and the ultimate abduction of Helen. Paris is a Trojan prince, and he's the son of Priam, who's the king of Troy, which will now collapse because of his son's momentary foolishness. Not even his characterological foolishness, as we will learn, but from just this split-second zig when you should have zagged kind of thing. And I'm going to read to you now the brief allusion to it that we get, and then I'll fill out the backstory. So what's just happened is Hector, the prince of the Trojans, has been killed. We're going to get into telling that whole story later on down the road, but this has basically sealed Troy's fate. Achilles, who killed him, has been desecrating his body out of sheer rage, and the gods of Olympus have gotten together to discuss what we should do about this, whether Achilles should be allowed to continue shaming this body and committing real sacrilege. I mean, it's one thing to defeat your enemy in war. It goes against all rules of decorum and decency then to shame his body and to violate it and mutilate it when, in fact, he stood against you understandably and totally legitimately on the field of battle. So it's decided that the body of Hector will be returned and that the gods will enable this to happen. Hermes is going to be the way that it gets done. And this plan pleases everybody except, we are told, the goddess Hera, the goddess Athena, and the god Poseidon. So here's the brief 5-line passage in Greek first, and then I'll read you my translation in English. Enth alois men pasin heindanin ude pofhere, ude Poseidaon, ude glaukopede kure, Alechon hosvin proton epektheto ilios hire, kai priamos, kai laos Alexandru henekates, hosne kesetheas, hote hoi mesaulon hikonto, tein de nes, he hoi poremaklosunein allegenein. So now, throughout this series, I want to try and translate as many of these passages for you myself as I can. Not because I think I am the best translator out there or there are no other translations that will work, but because translation is one great way to get under the skin of a text and really sift through the particular word choices. So I always learn a lot by translating, and hopefully it's fun for you to hear a fresh version. So this is, again, the same passage. All of the others were satisfied, but not Hera. Oh no, and not Poseidon, and not the maiden with flashing eyes. That's a stock allusion to Athena. So Hera, Poseidon, and Athena, not pleased. They persisted, just as they had from the very beginning, in rage at Priam and all of his people at Troy thanks to Alexander, besotted as he was when he aggrieved the goddesses who came upon him in the midst of his farmstead. He exalted the one who brought on his disastrous lust. So, holy Troy, in the original, it's said, holy Troy is brought low by this disastrous lust of Alexander. And we've got to know what has gone on in the background. Homer is clearly taking it for granted. There are other poems and other stories that develop this myth more generally and with more specifics. But Homer obviously expects us to know the details going in. It's one of the homework assignments, the prerequisites that we've done before we read the poem, because now he's making a little commentary on it. And by placing it in this position, he's saying something about the contingencies of human life and the difficulty of passing judgment on any human action, even the most disastrous one. So to fill you in here, I want to tell you the larger story of the Judgment of Paris, which is one of the core stories from Greek mythology. It gets retold again and again, both in the ancient world and in the modern world. It even gave its name to one of the most important events in the history of wine. If you've heard of the Judgment of Paris in wine, this was this 1976 wine tasting where Napa wines suddenly won out over French wines and made the reputation of California wines what it is today. And it's called the Judgment of Paris as a kind of pun because the tasting took place in Paris, but Paris, or he's also called Alexander, is the main character of this story. What's the story? Okay. First of all, you have to know that Thetis and Peleus are getting married. Thetis is the mother of Achilles. Peleus is his father, so there's a direct link here to the story of the Iliad proper. That is the main plot line. Thetis is a goddess. Peleus is a mortal. Zeus is throwing them a wedding party. All the gods are invited except for one, Eris. Eris is the goddess of strife. Now, if Eris were a reasonable person, which is sort of saying, like, if your jerk of a mother-in-law were a nice woman, but if Eris were a reasonable person, she would see that this judgment makes a certain degree of sense, because you can't just invite the embodiment of conflict to your party. Like, strife is kind of a party pooper. I don't know if you've ever seen that whole YouTube thing where the German guy hears about this girl Jessica who's a party pooper, and he doesn't understand the phrase, so he just goes around saying, Jessica poops at parties? Like, she just walks up into the party and she poops? That's sort of what Eris is like. She just walks into these parties and she poops. I mean, you really don't want to invite a guest that you know for 100% guarantee is going to cause beef among your other attendees, especially when those attendees are the gods of Olympus who already have notorious beef stretching back generations, eons. It's a party where, like, things are gonna be tense. There's gonna be family feuds. You're gonna try to avoid drama as much as possible. So if there's a woman literally named, essentially, Drama Llama, you probably don't invite her. Except, of course, damned if you do, damned if you don't, she's gonna be really pissed if you don't invite her. And so as a result, she's gonna mess things up anyway. And that's what Eris contrives to do. I'm filling in now many details that are from elaborate retellings of this story, but she basically throws this apple into the crowd at the reception. Lands in the middle of the dance floor. DJ stops playing. Everything falls silent because the apple has carved onto it the Greek word kaliste. And kaliste means to the fairest. So this apple belongs to the most beautiful goddess, the most fair and alluring goddess of all, whose charms are most highly renowned. 3 goddesses dive at it instantly. One of them is Hera, whom we heard about in the previous passage. The other is Athena, goddess of war and wisdom, whom we also heard mentioned indirectly in the passage. And the last one, whom we actually didn't hear in that particular passage, is Aphrodite, goddess of love and lust. So you've got the queen of the gods, the goddess of war, and the goddess of love, all fighting over this apple. And Zeus does what you would expect from an extremely chatified king of the gods, which is he passes the buck. He says, I'm sure the hell not getting in the middle of this cat fight. let's find some mortal patsy, some poor sap, to have to make this decision. And hard as it is to now believe, given his subsequent reputation, Paris, that is the son of Priam, the Prince of Troy, was actually known up until this point for his sound judgment. He had exhibited it in a number of other situations. And so Zeus thinks, I know what I'll do. I'll send these ladies to Paris, and Paris will make the choice for me so that I don't have to catch the flack for whatever decision he makes. They show up, Homer says, Messaulos, when he was in the middle of his fields, essentially. So we get this impression that Paris is like one of these sort of shepherd princes, kind of like King David, right? That he has a kind of rustic charm to him, maybe. He's tending to his fields, he's dealing with his livestock, whatever. And then even just in that brief mention, the whole picture kind of falls into the place. You can imagine the skies darkening, the winds blowing, and these three goddesses, mid-beef, come descending upon him to demand that he decide which one of them is fairer. And this is where great literature becomes a spectator sport. Because we're talking here about the episode, the Kardashians episode to beat all Kardashians episodes. And ever since this story was first told, there have been people doing recaps and counterfactuals and trying to decide what Paris should have done here and whether he bears the blame for making the wrong decision or whether there was really no good decision here, no way out of disaster. Because one thing we know is that he basically asked for his head to be turned into an orange. Obviously, the way things shook out, we can see with the benefit of hindsight that the decision Paris made, which was for Aphrodite, was the wrong decision. But consider now his suite of options, and write in, please, to tell me what you would have done in his position. Because each of these goddesses offers Paris one of three gifts. They all have powers, they all have sublime dominion over a sphere of human life. Hera is the queen of the goddesses, so she has power over lordliness and rule and reign. And she says, you can be king of Europe and Asia, a vast empire, unknown throughout the world up to this point. You can have dominion over these two continents. On the other hand, Athena says, I will grant you skill and prowess in war and wisdom and prudence in counsel. Finally, Aphrodite says, I have power over all charms, all lust, all allure. I will grant you the seductive abilities of Hugh Hefner. I mean, she wouldn't have said that at the time, but I will grant you the allure, the charm of Harry Belafonte. Nobody will be able to resist you, not even the most beautiful woman in the world, and you will have Helen of well, she wasn't then Helen of Troy, she was Helen of Sparta, but we'll get to that in a second. You will have Helen, the most beautiful woman in the world. What are you going to pick? Now, there will be some people who say, my man Paris did nothing wrong. Bro, cooked. Don't criticize him, because obviously in the struggle over who is most beautiful, all the man did was tell the truth. There's a clear answer here. Aphrodite is the most beautiful goddess. And this is why the story, I think, has had such staying power, because it's actually very cleverly engineered to balance multiple different goods and moral imperatives against each other, which is a Greek specialty. It's kind of how all tragedy works, is through the painful reality that sometimes there are conflicting imperatives with equal claim upon you. And one of the imperatives here, one would think, for any judge, would be honesty. Eris has laid down the gauntlet to the most beautiful goddess. Surely it was Aphrodite. Surely she was the one that other goddesses came to. In fact, we have scenes in the Iliad where Hera has to go to Aphrodite to get all dolled up and asks Aphrodite to lend her the charms of love. So if Paris were just going to tell the truth here, he would say Aphrodite. Of course, that's also clearly not the right decision. Because, okay, honesty is important. But buddy, when you're faced with three all-powerful or super-powerful divine entities, maybe be a little bit political. And so in that case, one of the other two goddesses is probably a safer bet because power and wisdom are both better protection and insurance against whatever else may come than lust. Lust gets people inevitably into trouble. You can't just go with that and call it a day. You could accept Hera's offer and become king, and then maybe you'll have a whole retinue to protect you against the wrath of the other goddesses. But famously, kings also come to ruin all the time. And actually, there's an argument that if you piss off Athena and Aphrodite, and they come for you while you're king of these grand nations, you're going to be very vulnerable to rebellions, coups, insurrections, all that other stuff. On the other hand, if you pick Athena, and now you can tell what I think I would have picked if I'd been in Alexander's shoes, she gives you wisdom. You can use wisdom to maneuver your way out of any other situation and potentially to gain any of the other benefits that you might want. And this was another theme of Greek mythology, and I think that the tenor of myth would sort of lean towards suggesting that that was probably the smartest choice. Because there are other stories, like one of the earliest kings of Athens was faced with the choice, not between Athena and other goddesses, but between Athena as patron for Athens and Poseidon as patron. And he went with Athena because she offered him the gift of the olive tree, which could be used for all these different things. You could use the wood to make ships or houses, but you could eat the olives themselves. You could use their oil for cleaning and polishing. And so that choice represented kind of the versatility of wisdom. And I would suspect that here the strong implication is you ought to go with Athena. In fact, there are other stories from other traditions that give us the same idea. I mean, if you think about even Solomon's choice that God gave him, right? What do you want upon your accession to the throne? Solomon says in 1 Kings, I am but a child, I know not how to go in or come out. Give me wisdom. And then God is so pleased with this decision that he grants Solomon a bunch of other good stuff too, in addition to this divine wisdom. So you kind of feel like maybe that was the smart choice here for Paris, although it's not without its dangers and its trade-offs as well. Paris, however, wishes that his head were an orange. And there's a million different interpretations here that the gossip magazines could give about exactly why he did that. Just in the same way that you can look at this orange-head guy and say, well, that doesn't make any sense. Or you can say, that's so human. I completely understand why you would shoot yourself in the foot that way. A lot of people have a lot of different reactions to what Paris did here, which doomed everything. Because after that, he sure got his reward, which was the hand of Helen, the most beautiful woman in the world. But she was already married to Menelaus, Prince of Sparta. And so when he absconded with Helen, at that point, Menelaus got his brother Agamemnon, and they called up all their pals around the different Greek islands and city-states, and they went to war with Troy. And coupled with the rage of Hera, who had just been spurned, and Athena, who had just been spurned, and Poseidon, who was also on the Greek side, it's like hell hath no fury, like two goddesses spurned and an angry, jilted husband coming for your town. So this was a catastrophe for everybody involved, and it set this enormous, inexorable chain of events in motion that fated the destruction of Troy. And it was for such a bagatelle. It was for such a frivolous dispute among goddesses who probably knew what the right answer was. And now we're confronted with one of the most profound aspects of Greek mythology, which Homer exploits to the full, even when he doesn't tell this story to begin with. The whole poem takes place in this context of an understanding that the life of man is filled with contingencies and accidents, and on top of that, self-destructive stupidity. So of course, yes, we are reasonable beings. We are entities capable of making choices. We can make better and worse choices. We have a certain degree of free will, but we are also overcome sometimes by what Homer calls ate, and that's the word he uses of Paris in this story, in this little moment. And it's a word that contains in it this huge ambiguity. It can mean blindness, and it could carry the assumption that actually in the presence of the embodiment of lust, that is Aphrodite, what choice did Paris really have? What choice does any of us have under the powers of the gods, as the disputes and struggles of powers far greater than our own take place above us, how much can any of us really influence the course of events? How much can one man alter the course of history? And so if that's what ate means, if he really is just overwhelmed by an all-powerful urge or impulse, then can we blame him for making the choice that ended up launching 1,000 ships? Maybe not. On the other hand, of course, we do know that ultimately we're capable of making these decisions. And so maybe ate means something more like madness or stupidity, that he was carried away by his lust, but he did still make the choice to do what we call thinking with the wrong organ. That is, he chose the immediate gratification right in front of him rather than the thing that would not only have protected him from disaster, but would have also been more responsible toward his community more generally. And so in that case, it's a story about how even men who have a reputation for sound judgment can, in a moment of blind passion, be led astray and make the wrong decision. And I think the genius of the story is that it doesn't tell you what the answer is. It just leaves that as the picture of the world, where we know we can make good choices. We know that we do have authority and power, and yet sometimes we are so overwhelmed by the circumstances, by our own foolhardy emotions, by just the passion of the moment, that we zig left when we should have zagged right. And that's certainly what happens to Paris. The question is, why? What could he have done differently? And in his position, would you have been able to do differently? Or are grand events like this in history really kind of fated or at least overdetermined? And the story gets even more complicated and even more difficult because after that, after the choice of Paris, you also have the choice of Helen, who goes with the guy. And there are a million questions, and when I say that they have been debated since antiquity, I mean people have been fighting over Helen since somebody first told this story. There are questions about whether she really had a choice, whether Paris had already made the choice, and now he was either so sexually irresistible or, in fact, literally just abducted her so that she had no choice at all, whatever in the matter, and this was effectively an instance of rape. Or whether Helen herself also chose lust, whether she saw this beautiful man, was so overcome, so besotted with her own form of ate, that she was just carried off and could have stayed, could have resisted, but didn't. Homer also gives us a portrait of what that ambiguity and that complexity is like, and it's one of the most sympathetic but also painful and in some ways ultimately perhaps damning portraits of a woman carried away by desire that exists in literature. In Book 3 of the Iliad, so early on, when we know that this war has already been raging, we finally meet Helen herself. We meet this woman who is the cause of it all, at least the proximate cause, and who by choosing to follow Alexander has spurred her husband on into battle. And we meet her in Troy because she's been carried away, and we never really get a straight answer out of her about whether she had a choice, whether she wanted to go, whether she was crazy at the time or just driven mad with lust. What we get instead is this wrenching and complicated back and forth interaction between her and Aphrodite. And we get the impression that they have this very long-standing relationship. So not only has Aphrodite now won the competition over the other goddesses for Alexander's allegiance, but she also, in this very human and understandable way, has a special relationship with the most beautiful woman in the world, who from her youth has kind of been dogged by her beauty as like a blessing and a curse, because of course it gives her this enormous power over men and this enormous cultural capital and currency, but it's also represented by Homer as a kind of cage, a kind of prison, which I think you might understand extraordinary beauty like that. And people have said when you're just like impossibly gorgeous, and I can personally relate, of course, when you're unbelievably beautiful, people look at you and they just see a pretty face, or they are so driven mad by your beauty that they can't relate to you on a human level. And perhaps you cause all this trouble wherever you go. All of that is contained in this interaction between Helen and Aphrodite. First, Helen says, not to Aphrodite, but to Priam, that she wishes she had died before she ever came to Troy, because now she's miserable. She's obviously the subject of everybody's opprobrium and blame, or at least a lot of people's opprobrium and blame. And it doesn't really seem as if Alexander is all he's cracked up to be. There's a really funny line about, I think it's Clark Gable, who was one of the great movie actors in all of Hollywood. And he was a big heartthrob on the screen, but apparently he wasn't actually all that good in bed. And somebody asked his wife, what do you do? Like, how do you cope with the fact that he's not all that good in bed? And maybe she was his ex-wife, because I can only imagine she was his ex-wife when she was willing to say that. But she says, well, when you're in bed with Clark Gable, you just close your eyes and pretend it's Clark Gable. That is, you have to imagine that he is the guy he's been made out to be by his heartthrob persona in movies. And there's something similar going on here, where when you're with Alexander, who's supposedly favored by Aphrodite, you just have to close your eyes and pretend it's Alexander. Because he comes across in the Iliad as kind of a fop, kind of a little bit of a pansy, or just somebody that is inconsequential, not a real man among men like the other heroes or like his brother Hector. So there's a disappointment there, which really rings true, I think, to what happens when you do chase after lust, and then you get your satisfaction, and suddenly it starts to curdle into just normal mundanities in everyday life, and what had seemed in the light of love and lust like a glowing prospect turns into just another disappointing and mundane reality. So perhaps there's something of that remorse and regret here in Helen's words. And then, of course, there's just this sense that now everything it's not worth the blood. It's not worth the bloodshed that has gone on ever since she made this choice. So all of that is present here when Aphrodite comes up to Helen in the disguise of a cherished old woman, says Homer, and tugs on her sleeve because Aphrodite has just saved Paris from being killed by Menelaus. Menelaus won a hand-to-hand combat duel with Paris, but he's been rescued by Aphrodite because she loves him. And now Aphrodite says to Helen, and she finds her on this high tower in Troy among the Trojan women. She tugs at the woman's fragrant robes, and she says, "Come, Alexander is calling you home. Go be with him. There he is in his room, splayed on his inlaid bed, glistening with beauty in fine-spun clothes. You'd never think he'd been fighting with another man. He looks more like he's just come from the dance floor or taken a break to sit down after dancing." So you see this appeal that Aphrodite is kind of trying to invest Alexander with, but you can also see how it might fall flat, because now there's this war going on. Things have gotten really serious. Helen is deep in over her head. She's gotten much more than she bargained for. We know that much, whether she chose to come or not. She's now been submerged in this terrible disaster for herself and her kin and her husband and all involved. And this protracted war is all being blamed on her. Meanwhile, she's got this Lothario spread out on like a tiger skin rug, wearing his fancy perfumed clothes, and it's probably all starting to get a bit tedious, especially when Aphrodite makes the sell that Paris is, it looks like he's just come from dancing. That might have been the wrong move. And one of the most interesting things about Homeric poetry is that gods are certainly super powerful, but they're not infallible. They can make missteps, and this is one, I think, because what Helen says next is, first of all, she sees right through Aphrodite's disguise, and Aphrodite is kind of the comic relief goddess in the poem, so she has a certain ineptitude about her, and this is one instance where she dresses herself up, but she's just basically too hot for anybody to confuse her for an old woman, and Helen knows her from of old, so she looks and she says, "Mistress, why come to me dressed up with ruses to trick me? Are you going to carry me off now to some new bustling city?" So right away, we get this impression that Helen recognizes the goddess who has always given her all these nice things and given her all her power and charm and beauty, but there's instantly a hint of menace because she's sort of a slave to this goddess. Whether it's because she's carried away by her lust or because the goddess has enchained her in an identity that's totally wrapped up with her physical appearance. Are you going to carry me off again now to some new bustling city, to Phrygia, or to the enchanting town of Maeonia? Is some new favorite of yours there, some eloquent man, since now Menelaus has beaten the blessed Alexander and chooses to take me back home, despicable thing that I am? Is that why you come alongside me now with your cunning ploys? Go sit beside him yourself, then. Forsake the ways of the gods, and never let your feet return to the paths of Olympus. Stay forever fussing and keeping watch over that man. Make yourself into his wife, or better still, his slave. But I won't go. It would be a point of abject shame to go groveling back to his bed, and moreover, the Trojan women would all despise me. My heart is smothered in wordless pain. I find that one of the most moving scenes, stirring scenes in all of the poem, because we get this full tortured portrait of a woman who probably has made some terrible mistake. We never quite know whether she had a choice in the matter. But the poem certainly suggests very strongly that she was swept up in the same the same madness that swept Alexander up when he made his choice. And whatever we want to say about the larger workings of fate, the larger kind of wheels that are turning here that make it impossible for anybody to escape the tragic doom that awaits them, from a human perspective, we know the experience of being caught up in lust, we know the regret that it brings, and we can really feel for Helen here as she basically reads Aphrodite the riot act, which is kind of a bold thing to say. Go you sleep with him. I am sick and tired of being your plaything. And there's enormous self-loathing in the feeling that now she's going to be taken back home. This is a motif that gets picked up again and again later on in the tragedies, that even after she's rescued, she's effectively a deeply damaged woman and scarred by this whole experience. So she says to Aphrodite, take your beauty and go sleep with Paris yourself if you're so enamored of him. This, of course, incurs the goddess's wrath, and so we're going to see now who holds the trump card. Because even though we can have these disputes over who Paris should have gone with and what Helen should have done, in the end, we're also being reminded again and again that the gods, these forces of nature, are so far above us that what can we really do? So, enraged, the divine Aphrodite turned on her and spoke. Don't provoke me, you wretch, or I'll cast you aside in anger. Then I'll despise you as fiercely as now I still love you. I'll make sure you suffer grim hatred on all sides, from Trojans and Greeks. Then you'll really know what it's like to suffer an evil fate. And at that, so she spoke, and Helen, the daughter of Zeus, was convulsed with fear. She went, with her glistening veil wrapped tightly around her in silence, escaping the notice of all the Trojan women. The goddess led the way. You tell me, is that a choice? Is that a representation of what it's like to be enslaved to your lust, even when your better judgment tells you you're wrong? Is this a portrait of an abusive relationship in which rape is involved? Is it simply a story about how the fate of mortals carries us helplessly to our doom? You tell me, but these are the hot topics that people have been doing podcasts about, so to speak, since long before there were actually podcasts. And I just find it enormously artful that Homer tells the whole story in the context of this myth and only touches on the story itself at the very end to remind us what we've just seen in the battle that ensues and unfolds. So as this series goes on, the next thing I'm going to tell you is how the Greeks came to Troy to win Helen back. how the judgment of Paris led to the voyage of the many ships and ultimately to the catastrophes described in the Iliad. But I wanted to show you, first of all, how the whole thing got started, the villain origin story, if that's what you want to call it, of Helen and Alexander, if indeed you think they were villains, and how the whole thing is sort of framed as a story about the small human foibles that get wrapped up into these enormous and tragically, unfairly huge, catastrophic life decisions. Kind of like when, in one stupid moment of weakness, you wish that your head was an orange. So write into me. I really want to know what you guys think. Is there a right answer to the judgment of Paris? Should Alexander have chosen something different than he did? Is that the right question to be asking about this story? Or is it simply there to just show us not how life ought to be, but how life simply is? Because it does do a tremendous job of that, and that's what's marvelous about these poems. Okay, looking forward to going through the rest of them with you. For now, I have an interesting mailbag question that I want to spend some time on. Mailbag questions come to me through Substack. So what you got to do is go to rejoiceevermore.substack.com. Sign up there for my mailing list. I send out a weekly newsletter on Fridays. I also do a bunch of extra goodies for people that support me with paid subscriptions, which I'm enormously grateful for. So please do send those by if you're interested. This week, I've got a question in the mailbag from Matt, and it's very simple. He says, are there any books you could recommend on how to improve having difficult conversations? So I like this because it's very practical. And Matt says, there are modern self-help books that deal with this, and lots of them. It's true. Raise all sorts of interesting points about this. This is one of the things that you could talk about with your therapist, but that ancient thinkers also dealt with at great length. And yes, I think there are some books that will help you to navigate those harder, I would think of them as confrontational interactions better. I will say from my own personal experience, I am a very conflict-averse person by nature. And so my style, if you want to call it that, tends to be kind of indirect, which is really not that great when you have to have difficult disputes with people, which are part of life. I think instinctively react to disputes or to problems or to conflicts as signs that something is going terribly wrong. But that's part of the first thing that you have to get over, is that sense that if you're having a fight or if you're having a dispute, then you've failed. Maybe you haven't failed. Maybe you're just in the subject matter or in the area where your relationship needs most urgently to grow. And so, first of all, getting a handle on that is something that I personally have had to work on, and then learning in the discomfort of that conversation to speak frankly and openly. To one of the things I love best that is a modern adage that I didn't get from an ancient book is you can say anything if you say it from the heart in these sorts of conversations. So learning ultimately to be forthright and truthful is, I think, one of the key difficulties for people like me who don't love conflict, don't love entering into these sorts of disputes. And then remembering that anything you aren't honest about, you will ultimately pay for later, either because you'll have to be honest about it later on, or because the resentment that you haven't voiced is going to come back to haunt you and bite you in the end. So, having said that this is an area where I struggle, I will now say that it's also an area where ancient texts and great books have really helped me a lot. And there's a number of them that I can recommend. And first and foremost, this is not going to be an original recommendation, but if you haven't read it already, I would say go away and read it right now. Marcus Aurelius, The Meditations. I'm actually revisiting this book because I'm working on a review of a biography of Aurelius that has just come out. And so I've been spending a lot of time with him and a lot of time with this short notebook, which really won't take you all that long to read, but can stay with you your whole life, of just personal reflections that he wrote while he was on campaign in the midst of war, the 170s AD. Aurelius was the emperor. He was dealing with a bunch of different rebellions on the eastern frontier of his enormous territory. And somehow, in the midst of all that, he found time to jot down things that had occurred to him and principles that he was trying to stick to amid all of his frustrations. And one of the first things off the bat that makes this such a wonderful book of philosophy for anybody that is trying to kind of improve here is that Aurelius is one of those rare philosophers who really just lets you in on his own perceived inadequacies. His sense that this is hard stuff. Even though it's simple, it's really not easy. And the most profound Stoic teachings, things like you have to retain a degree of detachment from things you can't control, are exactly the things that we fail at again and again. There are passages in the Meditations that are just about trying to get out of bed in the morning and failing over and over again. And I just find this, I mean, the word, of course, that comes immediately to mind is relatable, but it's also very reassuring. And it can be, therefore, I think, more helpful. It's one of the reasons why this is one of the most popular books of philosophy throughout all of history. People come back to Aurelius because despite being, in fact, a great man, he also, whether intentionally or not, he may not really have meant these notes for public consumption, but he gives us this invaluable record of what it's like to be a great man on the inside. And it doesn't look like perfectly embodying all principles of your philosophy at all times and effortlessly whenever you need to. It actually looks like berating yourself day by day over and over again. A friend of mine, Chris Flannery, who is an editor at the Claremont Review of Books, was just telling me all about how the notebooks and journals of John Adams and John Quincy Adams are full of self-reproach. And you get these entries on New Year's where they'll look back on the year and they'll just say, another year wasted. These are the people that were building the country. And they're talking about how all these things they've let slip by, all these ways they've fallen short. So I find that in itself incredibly helpful and just a good series of insights into what it's like to do great work, so that you don't feel when you're having these sorts of difficult conversations, when you're having conflicts, when you're having setbacks, so that you don't feel like that means you're never going to live a life that will be worthy of commemoration or celebration. Even the most worthy men throughout history who have done the greatest things also were sitting around thinking, man, is it really supposed to be this hard? So I would send you to the Meditations, and I would read to you in particular, since you're asking about difficult conversations, this passage from Book 9. This is Book 9, Chapter 42 of Aurelius' Meditations. And it's one of the most famous passages. He says, when you run up against someone else's shamelessness, ask yourself this: is a world without shamelessness possible? No. Then don't ask the impossible. There have to be shameless people in the world. This is one of them. So maybe your difficult conversations aren't the result of somebody actively being the most, having character flaws, but maybe they are. And if they are, I think this is a really helpful first step. And even if it's just part of the circumstances of the world, one of the things that Stoicism can help you to understand, first and foremost, is things aren't just going to go perfectly your way all the time. And the first step to kind of grappling with them is to accept that as a basic fact, an immovable fixture of the world. This includes trying and difficult people, but it also includes circumstances that just aren't all that great. It's one of the things that Stoicism actually, I think, shares with Christianity, is a tragic acceptance of the fallen world. Or from a Stoic perspective, this would be more like the inevitability of encountering things that are going to challenge you. And so, since that's going to be the case, you can put out of your mind the imaginary picture of a perfect life without conflict that you might be working toward, that might be causing you all this grief. If you let go of that picture, then you can start to treat the scenario in front of you as the scenario it actually is, without your illusions about how perfect it can be. And you can ask, well, given the conflict that I'm in, what's the reality of the situation? What are the possibilities on the ground? And how can I address the situation in a way that moves me closer toward my goal? So there's, off the bat, an excellent introduction to this whole situation. Then he says, the same is true for someone vicious or untrustworthy, or with any other defect. Remembering that the whole class has to exist will make you more tolerant of its members. Another useful point to bear in mind: what qualities has nature given us to counter that defect? As an antidote to unkindness, it gave us kindness and other qualities to balance other flaws. This passage is one of the ways I think that people start to feel as if Stoicism was kind of a precursor to Christianity, or Christianity maybe even could have endorsed a lot of Stoicism's precepts, is this unflagging counsel of forbearance that Marcus gives and seems to have tried to follow. Even when there was an insurrection against him, he didn't punish those involved as severely as his advisors wanted him to, because he had this attitude that on some level there's going to come conflict into the world. And he was a fatalist about it. You don't have to be. But Jesus also says there are going to come stumbling blocks into the world. There's going to come sin into the world. He says, woe to him through whom it comes. But from your perspective, as somebody who can't control the brokenness or the difficulty of the situation, your question is, am I going to introduce more of that brokenness and ugliness into the situation, or am I going to introduce its opposite, its antidote? And so that's a great question that Aurelius asks. When others stray off course, you can always try to set them straight, because every wrongdoer is doing something wrong, doing something the wrong way. And how does it injure you in any way? You'll find that none of the people you're upset about has done anything that could do damage to your mind. But that's all that harm or injury could mean. And this is another classic Stoic idea, that true harm and true blessedness are only to be found in the posture and the health of the soul. And so if the health of the soul isn't compromised, then you are ultimately going to be secure. So there's nothing anybody can do if you are secure in that inner groundedness. There's nothing anybody that can do to truly threaten you. And one of the ways that people tend to lash out or to behave in unhelpful ways in difficult situations is when they feel threatened. It's very, very easy to feel threatened, especially when you're dealing with people that touch, nerves and who are close to you in this or that or the other way. But starting from a posture of reliance, I would say, on God, the Stoics would say on nature or on the Logos, starting from that posture of reliance is a really helpful tip for avoiding the situation where your personal identity is wrapped up in the conflict, because that will cloud your vision and stop you from thinking logically about what you want, how you can get it, who you're working with, how you can best persuade them, all these things that you require for detachment going into difficult conversations. Yes, boorish people do boorish things. What's strange or unheard of about that? Isn't it yourself you should reproach for not anticipating they'd act this way? The Logos gave you the means to see it, that a person would act a given way, but you paid no attention, and now you're astonished that he's gone and done it. You see how this is kind of self-talk, that Marcus is probably thinking here of a time when he lost his temper and wishes that he shouldn't, and he goes on in this vein, but I'm just giving you this passage as an illustration of how these kinds of books, I think, can be really helpful, not just as instructive general principles for how to have difficult conversations, but as object lessons and as stories from history and examples to emulate for how to behave in your own life. Now you're astonished that untrustworthy people are untrustworthy. So when you call someone untrustworthy or ungrateful, turn the reproach on yourself. We might think here of, before you take the mote out of your brother's eye, take the plank out of your own. It was you who did wrong, but assuming that someone with those traits deserve your trust. So accountability, right? That before you trust somebody, you have made a judgment about whether they are trustworthy. So the only things for you to now ask about are the things that are within your control. I'm not saying that every difficult situation is one that you brought upon yourself by acting wrongly. I'm just saying that looking inwardly is a great way of starting to think about, what can I do to fix this situation? What are my options here on the table? Because there's so much stuff in these conversations, for me at least, so much baggage that gets raised up, that you can lose sight of these personal questions about how you personally are going to proceed and how to act. And Marcus is great for reminding you about that, right? Instead of looking at the action itself for your reward, what else did you expect from helping someone out? Isn't it enough that you've done what your nature demands? You want a salary for it too? So much of this stuff is lifted right out of the gospel. We are only unworthy servants. So that's one book that I would send to you for a really fantastic insight into how one great man had coped with difficult situations, difficult conversations. Another would be Plutarch's How to Tell a Flatterer from a Friend is a wonderful little guide into personal relationships and how they can be navigated in the most sort of serene and shrewd kind of way. And then, of course, I'm going to send you to the Gospel, and especially, actually, not just to the Gospel, but to the Bible more generally, and to the book of Proverbs, which has a ton of stuff in there about personal accountability and sort of basic building blocks for how you can set yourself up to deal well with these sorts of conversations. I speak, as Seneca wrote in one of his letters, to fellow patients in the same hospital. That is, I'm not talking from some position of absolute authority here, but I would counsel you to take a look at these books if you're trying to find your way through just the perennial stuff that inevitably comes up, the conflict that arises in disputes and in daily life. A lot of this stuff has not changed since the very beginning of time. A lot of these great thinkers who have dealt with these vast questions, the scale of the Homeric poems and the wars between Troy and Greece, have also dealt with the minor peccadillos and frustrations of difficult conversations like the ones you're trying to have. Okay, Matt, hope that helps. Let me know if you enjoy the meditations, if you enjoy this podcast more generally. We will be picking back up after the Judgment of Paris next week with the outbreak of war in Troy and the kickoff of the Iliad proper. That is the story with which the poem begins. Thank you so much for listening. One more thing to tell you about is the I Maked This section of the podcast, where I tell you about stuff I do outside of this podcast. This time I'm going to send you to Amazon to pre-order my Gateway to the Epicureans, which is coming out later on this year. The link is in the show notes, as well as links to a bunch of other stuff that I've talked about and mentioned, including my Substack at rejoiceevermore.substack.com. Thanks for being with me. I will see you next time for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.